I never thought I could feel pure, unadulterated hatred for the two people who brought me into this world. But life has a twisted way of showing you who people truly are when the masks finally slip off. Just 3 weeks after my husband, the love of my life and the father of my children, passed away in a tragic accident, my parents stood right outside my front door, laughing hysterically at his death, mocking his memory, and celebrating that he was finally gone from my life. They had absolutely no clue that my neighbor's security camera was rolling, capturing every single second of their cruelty in crystal-clear high definition, recording the monstrous words flying out of their mouths. When that footage was handed to me, it felt like my heart was ripped out of my chest all over again, but it also lit a fire inside of me that burned away every last shred of familial loyalty I had left. Was I wrong for using that exact footage to completely destroy their social standing, ruin their reputations in our community, and cut them out of my life permanently without a single ounce of remorse? Tell me if you would have done the exact same thing if you found out the people who were supposed to comfort you in your darkest hour were actually dancing on your partner's grave. To understand how things could ever get this twisted, you have to understand who my husband, David, was, and the absolute stranglehold my parents tried to maintain over my life since the day I was born. My parents, Richard and Alina, are the definition of high society snobs who care infinitely more about appearances, wealth, and social status than they do about actual human connection or happiness. Growing up, my life was mapped out for me down to the smallest detail, from the colleges I was allowed to look at to the career paths they deemed acceptable for someone bearing our family name. But everything changed when I met David during my junior year of college. He wasn't a trust fund baby. He didn't come from a family with a pedigree, and he didn't care about the country club lifestyle. David was a self-made man, a brilliant carpenter who worked with his hands, possessed an infectious laugh that could brighten the darkest room, and had a heart so genuinely kind it put everyone else to shame. The moment I introduced David to my parents, the atmosphere in the room turned ice cold, as my mother took one look at his calloused hands and his simple button-down shirt and looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. My father didn't even bother to look him in the eye when they shook hands, immediately asking David what his father did for a living and what kind of asset portfolio he managed, only to turn away in disgust when David proudly replied that his dad was a retired mechanic. From that very first dinner, my parents made it their absolute mission to sabotage our relationship, constantly whispering in my ear that I was throwing my life away, that I was settling for a blue-collar nobody, and that I would regret marrying someone who couldn't provide the lavish lifestyle they thought I deserved. But I didn't care about their shallow money or their approval, because David provided me with something they never could, which was unconditional love, emotional safety, and a real sense of belonging. When David and I got married in a beautiful, modest backyard ceremony, my parents showed up late, dressed entirely in black as if they were attending a funeral, and spent the entire evening sitting in the corner whispering to each other and making snide remarks about the catering and the music. Despite their toxic negativity, David never once lost his temper or spoke ill of them, always telling me that they were my parents, that he respected them for raising me, and that he hoped over time they would see how happy he made me and eventually change their minds. For 7 incredible years, David and I built a beautiful life together, welcoming our daughter Maya into the world and saving up every penny to buy a charming, older fixer-upper house in a quiet, tight-knit neighborhood. David spent countless weekends renovating that house with his own 2 hands, turning it into our dream home, pouring his love into every wall, every bookshelf, and every piece of furniture he custom-built for us. My parents, meanwhile, rarely visited, and whenever they did drop by, it was only to make passive-aggressive comments about the size of our kitchen, the neighborhood we chose, or how Maya deserved to grow up in a private gated community instead of a regular suburban street. They constantly tried to hand us checks for country club memberships or offered to buy us a bigger house in their neighborhood, which were always thinly veiled attempts to control us and make David feel inadequate. But David and I always politely declined, standing strong as a team. Then, the unthinkable happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that shattered my entire universe into a million pieces, leaving me completely disoriented and paralyzed by grief. David was driving home from a job site when a distracted driver running a red light slammed into the driver's side of his truck at full speed, killing him instantly on impact. I still remember the exact moment two police officers knocked on my door, their faces grim and solemn, and delivered the news that completely ended the life I knew, plunging me into a dark, suffocating abyss of sorrow. In the days following his death, I was an absolute zombie, barely able to breathe, let alone take care of funeral arrangements, manage the house, or figure out how to look my 5-year-old daughter in the eye and explain to her that her daddy was never coming home. My neighbors were absolute angels during this time, bringing over endless casseroles, offering to watch Maya, helping me rake the yard, and doing everything they could to support us, with our next-door neighbor Marcus being an especially incredible pillar of strength. Marcus had been close friends with David, often sharing tools and working on garage projects together, and he promised me he would keep a close eye on the house and help me with anything I needed while I tried to navigate this impossible tragedy. My parents, on the other hand, showed up to the funeral looking appropriately somber for the cameras and the public eye, playing the roles of grieving, supportive grandparents to absolute perfection in front of our extended family and friends. My mother wept softly into a silk handkerchief, and my father held my arm tightly as we walked to the gravesite, receiving condolences from everyone and absorbing the sympathy as if they were the ones who had suffered a devastating loss. But the moment the public eye was off them, their attitude shifted completely, and their true, sickening colors began to bleed through the facade they had so carefully constructed. In the 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother started calling me multiple times a day. Not to check on my mental health or ask how Maya was coping, but to aggressively pressure me into selling our house and moving back into their estate. She would drop comments about how the house was too much work for a single woman, how a carpenter's salary probably didn't leave behind a substantial life insurance policy, and how I needed to think about my future and find a man who could actually secure my place in society. I begged her to stop, screaming through my tears that my husband had only been dead for a couple of weeks, that I loved our home, and that I couldn't even think about moving or dadding because my heart was completely broken. My father was even worse, calling me to discuss David's estate and asking if David had left behind any debts that might tarnish the family name, treating the sudden, violent death of my husband like a minor, irritating financial inconvenience that needed to be cleaned up quickly. I eventually stopped answering their phone calls and texts altogether, needing physical and emotional space to weep in peace, to hold my daughter close, and to try to process the overwhelming reality that I was now a widow at 32 years old. This brings us to a chilly Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after David's passing, when I had to leave the house for a couple of hours to meet with a grief counselor and pick up some of Maya's favorite comfort foods from the grocery store. My parents had texted me earlier that day saying they were going to drop off some paperwork regarding a trust fund they wanted to set up for Maya, and even though I told them I wouldn't be home and asked them to come another day, they insisted they would drop it in our mailbox anyway. While I was out, Marcus, who works from home and has a clear view of our driveway and front porch, noticed my parents' luxury sedan pull up to the front of my house. He watched them get out of the car, expecting them to simply drop a letter in the box and leave. But instead, he noticed through his window that they were standing on my porch for an unusually long time, gesturing wildly and looking around. Marcus has a high-tech, motion-activated security camera system mounted on his garage that covers his entire driveway and perfectly captures the front porch and walkway of my house with crystal-clear audio recording capabilities. Later that evening, after I had returned home and put Maya to bed, I heard a soft knock on my front door, and when I opened it, I found Marcus standing there with his laptop in his hands, looking completely pale, furious, and deeply uncomfortable. He asked if he could come inside because he had seen something on his security feed from earlier that afternoon that he felt morally obligated to show me, even though he knew it would break my heart. So that is the horrific, heartbreaking situation I found myself in, sitting on my living room couch with my husband's best friend, about to watch a video that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I tell you exactly what my parents did and said on that porch, and how I used that very footage to execute a brutal, calculated revenge that stripped them of everything they cared about, I want you to pause right now and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have confronted them immediately with screaming and shouting? Or would you have quietly bided your time to make sure they paid the ultimate price for their cruelty? I sat down next to Marcus on the couch, my hands trembling as he opened his laptop, hit play on the recorded video file, and turned the screen toward me so I could see the footage clearly. The video starts with my parents walking up my front steps, looking around the porch with expressions of utter disdain, as my mother dramatically wipes a speck of dust off her designer handbag and my father sighs loudly. My mother looks at the custom-built wooden bench that David had made for our porch just a few months before he died, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that he had spent weeks sanding and staining to perfection. In the video, my mother scoffs loudly, points her manicured finger at the bench, and says, "God, I am so incredibly glad that tacky DIY eyesore of a phase is finally over with. I can't wait until we force her to sell this dreadful little shack and get her back to a proper neighborhood where people actually hire professional contractors." My father lets out a dark, mocking chuckle, shakes his head, and replies, "Tell me about it, Alina. Honestly, that car accident was the absolute best thing that could have ever happened to our daughter's future. It's a tragic shame it took 7 whole years, but the trash finally took itself out, and now she can finally marry someone of our own stature." I watched the screen in absolute horror, the breath completely leaving my lungs, as my mother threw her head back and laughed out loud, a sharp, joyful sound that echoed through the quiet afternoon air on the recording. She literally clapped her hands together in glee, looking at my father and saying, "I know I shouldn't say it out loud, Richard, but when the police called her, I literally had to hide my smile. We finally don't have to pretend to care about that pathetic, blue-collar charity case at Thanksgiving anymore, and we can finally get our daughter back from that loser." They stood there on my porch for another 2 minutes, casually joking about how David's life insurance policy probably wouldn't even cover the cost of a decent country club membership, laughing about how glad they were that they would never have to see his working-class family again, and making fun of the clothes he wore to family dinners. They then stuffed the envelope into my mailbox, completely oblivious to the camera lens staring directly at them from across the driveway, and walked back to their luxury car, smiling and chatting as if they had just enjoyed a lovely stroll through a park. By the time the video ended, the silence in my living room was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged, heavy breathing as tears of pure rage and deep betrayal spilled over my eyelashes and poured down my cheeks. Marcus closed his laptop gently, reached out to squeeze my hand, and told me that he was profoundly sorry, but he couldn't sit on this information and let them pretend to be loving parents while harboring such disgusting, venomous thoughts about David. I looked at Marcus, my voice shaking but my mind suddenly becoming piercingly, dangerously clear, and asked him to copy the video file onto a flash drive and email it to me immediately. The crushing weight of grief that had been paralyzing me for the past 3 weeks suddenly crystallized into a cold, hard, unyielding wall of fury, and I knew right then and there that a simple screaming match over the phone would never be enough to satisfy the debt they owed. My parents cared about exactly 2 things in this world: their immaculate social standing among the city's elite and their absolute control over their family image, and I realized I held the exact weapon needed to completely incinerate both. I spent the next 48 hours meticulously planning my counterstrike, moving silently and calmly like a ghost, ensuring that every single detail was perfectly aligned so they would never see the blow coming until it was far too late to save themselves. First, I went to a local lawyer and legally revoked the power of attorney paperwork I had previously signed giving them medical and financial decisions over me in case of an emergency, and I rewrote my will to ensure they would never, under any circumstances, get custody of Maya if anything happened to me. Next, I discovered that the upcoming Saturday evening was my parents' annual charity gala, a massive, black-tie fundraising event that they hosted every year for the city's top pediatric hospital, which was the absolute crown jewel of their social calendar. This gala was attended by hundreds of prominent figures, including local politicians, wealthy business owners, doctors, and all of my parents' high society friends, And it was the one night of the year where they got to bask in the spotlight as pillars of benevolence and virtue. I called the event coordinator for the country club where the gala was being held, using my name to bypass security, and told them that I had prepared a special, surprise tribute slideshow to honor my late husband and to thank my parents publicly for their incredible support during my time of grief. The coordinator was deeply moved by the idea, instantly agreeing to integrate my video presentation into the main projector system right before the keynote speeches, promising me it would be a beautiful, tear-jerking highlight of the evening. When Saturday night arrived, I dressed in a stunning, elegant black gown, put on a brave face for my daughter, left her with a trusted babysitter, and drove down to the country club with the flash drive tucked safely inside my clutch. I slipped into the grand ballroom unnoticed just as the dinner service was concluding, standing in the shadows at the back of the room as the lights began to dim for the evening's presentations. My parents were seated at the grand head table right at the front of the stage, glowing with pride, drinking expensive champagne, and smiling brightly as the master of ceremonies took the microphone to announce a very special, impromptu presentation from the host's grieving daughter. I saw my mother look around the room in surprise, a look of smug satisfaction spreading across her face, as she whisper-boasted to the wealthy couple sitting next to her about how strong and poised her daughter was being despite her recent loss. The large projection screens lowered from the ceiling on both sides of the stage, and the room grew dead silent as the video feed clicked on, starting with a beautiful, touching 3-minute montage of photos of David, Maya, and me, set to soft, instrumental music. I watched from the back of the room as people in the crowd smiled softly, wiped away tears, and turned to look at my parents, who were nodding solemnly and holding hands to play up their roles as the grieving, supportive rocks of the family. But then, right at the 4-minute mark, the beautiful music abruptly cut to static, and the text on the screen transitioned to a simple, bold sentence. And now, a special message from Richard and Alina on the true meaning of family support. Before anyone in the room could even process what was happening, the footage from Marcus's security camera flashed onto the massive screens, filling the entire ballroom with loud, echoing, high-definition audio of my mother's sharp, mocking laughter. The entire audience watched in stunned, breathless horror as my mother clapped her hands on screen and proudly proclaimed that she had to hide her smile when the police called to report David's death. The ballroom became so incredibly quiet you could hear a pin drop as my father's voice boomed through the speakers, clearly stating that the fatal car accident was the absolute best thing that could have ever happened to my future, and calling my dead husband a blue-collar charity case and trash. I kept my eyes locked onto my parents' faces at the head table, watching the absolute blood drain from their skin in real time, their expressions shifting from smug pride to utter, paralyzing terror as they realized exactly what was playing for the entire community to see. My mother looked like she was going to vomit, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, while my father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white, staring at the screen as his own monstrous words echoed off the walls of the country club. The video played out to its bitter end, showing them laughing about my husband's life insurance and walking back to their car with joyful smiles, before the screen finally faded to black with one last message from me. Thank you, Richard and Alina, for showing me your true colors. You are officially dead to me and my daughter. When the lights in the ballroom came back up, the silence was absolutely suffocating, as hundreds of the city's most prominent citizens sat frozen in their seats, staring at my parents with expressions of profound disgust, horror, and unmitigated revulsion. No one clapped, no one spoke, and several of my mother's closest friends immediately stood up from their tables, grabbed their coats, and walked out of the room without casting a single glance back at them. I stepped out from the shadows at the back of the room, walked calmly down the center aisle right past the stunned guests, and stood directly in front of my parents' table, looking down at them with a cold, unwavering stare. My mother tried to reach out to grab my dress, her eyes wild with panic as she whimpered, "Sweetie, please. It was taken out of context. We didn't mean it like that. You have to understand." But I simply stepped back, completely out of her reach. I looked her dead in the eye and said, loud enough for everyone around us to hear perfectly, The trash finally took itself out of my life. Never look at me, never speak to me, and stay the hell away from my daughter for the rest of your miserable lives. With that final statement, I turned around and walked out of the country club, my head held high, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of peace and vindication washing over me as the heavy doors closed behind me. The aftermath of that night was an absolute nuclear explosion for my parents' social, professional, and personal lives, completely decimating everything they had spent decades building. Within 48 hours, the board of directors for the pediatric hospital issued a public statement condemning their remarks, stripping them of their titles, and banning them from ever hosting or attending the charity gala again. My father's business partners faced massive backlash from clients who had seen the rumors floating around social media, forcing my father into an early, forced retirement to save the firm's reputation from completely tanking. They became absolute pariahs in their own neighborhood and country club, with people actively turning their backs on them when they walked into a room, refusing to sit at their tables, and ignoring their phone calls and invitations. They tried sending flying monkeys, extended family members and old family friends, to call me and beg me to forgive them, claiming that exposing them publicly was cruel and that family should keep their dirty laundry private. But I blocked every single one of them without a second thought, and when my parents had the audacity to show up at my house a week later to beg for forgiveness, I didn't even open the door. I simply called the police and had them formally trespassed from my property. Looking back on everything that happened, I don't feel a single ounce of regret, guilt, or sorrow for what I did to them, because they earned every single bit of the misery they are experiencing now. When you lose the person you love most in this world, you realize very quickly that life is entirely too short to tolerate toxic, cruel, and manipulative monsters, even if they happen to share your DNA. David was a man who brought nothing but love, light, and genuine kindness into this world, and I will spend the rest of my life protecting his memory and protecting our beautiful daughter from the poison of the people who raised me. Thank you all so much for listening to my story and standing by me through the darkest and most turbulent chapter of my entire life. Please like this video if you were on my side and believe that my parents got exactly what they deserved for their disgusting cruelty. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life stories just like this one, and make sure to share your final thoughts on this whole crazy mess in the comments section down below. I'll see you all in the next story, so take care of yourselves and hold your loved ones close.